All right, so today we're taking a deep dive into one of the really big ones. Um, Arthur Schopenhauer's The World is Will and Presentation.
Yeah, this is a work that's trying to really get at the essence of the world as a whole. All of it, the entirety of existence, both in these grand, sweeping terms, but also getting down into the specifics of how things actually appear to us. And he does this whole thing very abstract, lots of conceptual frameworks. But the important thing to keep in mind, I think, is that Schopenhauer is not really setting out to explain where the world came from, why it exists, or what its purpose is. It's more about the intrinsic character, more of a what than a why. You know what I mean?
Right, so we're not looking at the origin story.
Yeah.
We're not necessarily looking at the end game. It's about the nature of it, the whatness of it, will and Vorstellung.
Yeah, and those are right out of the gate. Those are the key terms, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And you really have to sort of wrestle with them to get at what Schopenhauer is saying.
So to get us started, Schopenhauer, he says, the world as we, see it and experience it, that's what he calls presentation,
Right.
or Vorstellung. So this is like our everyday reality, the world we interact with, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the key thing here is that for Schopenhauer, this is all totally dependent on the person who is perceiving it.
Okay, so it's not just like an objective world out there that's the same for everyone.
No, not really. The way the world appears is completely tied to the consciousness that is doing the perceiving.
So my reality could be different from yours.
In a way, yeah. I mean, the basic building blocks might be the same, but how we understand and interpret them, that's all individual.
That's pretty wild.
Yeah.
So how does Schopenhauer say this whole perception thing works then? What's going on in our brains?
Well, he says the intellect and understanding are super important. They're like the tools that we use to structure our perception.
Right.
And the law of causality, that's a big part of this understanding. It's the framework we use to make sense of all the, sensory information we're getting.
So cause and effect. If I see a ball rolling, I know something must have pushed it.
That's how we organize our experiences. And Schopenhauer, he takes it even further. He says that for there to even be a world we can perceive, bodies need to be able to affect each other.
Okay.
And animals need to have senses to pick up on those effects.
So if a tree falls in the forest and no one is around to hear it, it doesn't make a sound.
Well, it makes vibrations, but those vibrations only become a sound when a hearing being is there to perceive them.
I see. So interaction and our ability to sense things are the basis for this presentation of the world, right?
But there's something about the way Schopenhauer uses the word object here.
Right.
It's not the usual way we think of it.
So what does he mean by object then?
At first, it's not a fully formed philosophical idea for him. It's through this thing called the understanding that a presentation actually becomes an object we can perceive in space.
Okay, so it's our brains are taking this raw sensory data and shaping it into the objects we see around us.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Cool. So now Schopenhauer, he's also talking about this guy Kant, right? Another philosopher. What's their deal?
Yeah, they're both working with some similar ideas. Schopenhauer agrees with Kant that stuff like arithmetic and geometry, they're based on pure intuition.
Mm-hmm.
But he's not so keen on how Kant uses the words phenomenon and noumenon.
Yeah.
Schopenhauer thinks Kant's vocabulary isn't really capturing what's going on.
So what does Schopenhauer say instead?
Well, he says the things that shape our experience, like space, time, causality, those are what he calls a priori elements. It means they're built into our cognitive process. They're either part of how we perceive things,
right,
or they're directly related to the objects of our perception.
Gotcha. So that's his take on the world as presentation, how it shows up in our minds.
And this is Schopenhauer saying that right off the bat, everything that you're conscious of, everything that you experience, that's your presentation. It's the world as it appears to you.
Yeah, but he's not talking about raw data hitting the senses.
Yes.
This is where the understanding comes in.
Right, exactly. This is not just a jumble of sensations. Schopenhauer brings in this idea of the understanding, which is our faculty of applying reason, right? And the key to that is the principle of causality.
Yeah.
Cause and effect, this is how we make sense of the world, by seeing things connected through cause and effect.
So without that, we wouldn't have the phenomenal world, the world as we experience it.
Right, and this is actually one of the really interesting things, I think, in how he sets this up. He talks about these two conditions for the world to be knowable at all, right? So the first one, objectively, things have to actually be able to affect one another. So bodies in the world need to be capable of producing changes in each other. That's like the objective side. And then on the subjective side, that's where the understanding comes in. Our minds, they have to apply this law of causality. This is how we stitch together, all those individual sensations into a coherent picture of the world. So for the listener, think about it, everything you see, everything you hear, it only makes sense because you're connecting it through this idea of cause and effect.
Right. The raw sensory input is just chaos. It's noise. It's that static on the old TV screen. It's the understanding that turns it into a picture.
Right.
That turns it into something meaningful.
Exactly. It's like, imagine you're looking at a bunch of scattered pixels. Right. They don't mean anything on their own. But your understanding, that's like the software that arranges them into a recognizable image.
Okay. So we have this world of presentation shaped by our understanding. Now the question becomes, well, how real is that? What about the reality of the external world?
Yeah, and here's where things get even trickier, right? So Schopenhauer, he's drawing a distinction between two types of presentations. One is perceptual presentations. So those are like actual objects that we experience,
Right.
things we see and touch and hear in the world around us. But then there's also abstract presentations, and those are the concepts, the ideas that we form.
So one is like the tree and the other is the concept tree.
Precisely. And for Schopenhauer, the principle that governs both of these is the principle of sufficient reason, or the principle of sufficient ground. But it operates in different ways depending on whether we're talking about a real object or a concept.
Right. The sufficient reason for the tree being there is different from the sufficient reason for the idea of tree being true.
Exactly. So with real objects, the principle of sufficient reason, it manifests as causality. Cause and effect. The tree exists because something caused it to grow. But for concepts, the sufficient reason is different. It's more about the ground of knowledge. So the concept tree is true because it refers to something real in the world. It has a grounding in reality.
So the tree is because of what caused it, and the concept tree is true because it matches up with something real.
That's it. And Schopenhauer goes on to emphasize that the world of perception in itself, it doesn't contain error or truth. That stuff comes in later when we start reflecting on it, when we start forming judgments.
So the world just is.
Right, exactly. It's neither true nor false. It's just there, presented to us. Those categories, truth and falsehood, they belong to the realm of abstract thought.
But what about this other part? The world as will.
Right, yeah, that's where things get really interesting. Schopenhauer's big, central idea is that underneath this world of presentation, there's something even more fundamental. He calls it will, or will.
Will, huh? Like willpower.
Kind of, but it's bigger than that. It's like the driving force behind everything in the material world. Everything we see and experience, it's all just an expression of this will.
So like everything is made of this will stuff.
In a way, yeah. Like our bodies, the trees, the stars, it's all the will objectifying itself, taking on different forms.
That's a pretty huge idea.
It is. Schopenhauer sees this will as the inner essence of everything. Not just living things, but like all of nature.
Wow. So even a rock has will.
Not in the way we usually think of it, no. It's more like the rock is a manifestation of the will, a particular way that it expresses itself. But when it comes to animals, especially humans, Schopenhauer says this will can even seem like a conscious subject itself.
Like it becomes self-aware.
In a sense, yeah. He has this line where he says the world is the will's self-cognizance.
Whoa. So the universe is like waking up through us.
That's one way to interpret it, yeah. It's like this deep interconnectedness where everything is participating in the will's journey of self-discovery.
That's pretty mind-blowing.
Yeah.
But, we have to be careful here, right? Because there's this distinction between the will itself and how it appears in the world.
That's crucial to understanding Schopenhauer. The will itself is like this, pure force. It's not bound by the limitations of the world as we experience it.
Right, right. So how does this all connect to the principle of sufficient ground? You mentioned that before.
Ah, yes. The principle of sufficient ground. That's like a big rule that governs everything that appears to us, everything in the world of presentation. It says that for everything and every event, there has to be a reason why it exists or happens.
Okay, that makes sense. Like there's a reason why I'm sitting here talking to you right now.
And Schopenhauer, he breaks down this principle into different, categories or modes.
And one of these modes applies to us, right? Like our choices and actions.
Right. That's the fourth class of objects under the principle of sufficient ground. It's about how we, as self-aware beings, make decisions.
So like free will.
Well, that's where it gets tricky. Schopenhauer says that in this mode, the principle becomes the law of motivation.
Law of motivation, okay.
So every action we take, it's driven by a motive, a specific state of mind that we're in at that moment.
So it's not just random. There's a reason behind it.
Yeah, and that reason is tied to our character, who we are deep down. The motive acts on our character, and that's what determines our actions.
So in a way, we are kind of predictable.
In a sense, yeah. But hold on, because here's where Schopenhauer throws a curveball. He says that the will itself, like the pure will, the thing in itself, it's groundless.
Groundless. What does that even mean?
It means it has no cause. It exists outside of the rules of the world of presentation, including time, space, and even the principle of sufficient ground.
Wait, so the will doesn't follow the same rules as everything else?
Not exactly. It's like the source of those rules, but it's not bound by them.
That's confusing.
Yeah, I know, right? It's like this paradox. We feel like we have free will, we make choices, but at the same time, Schopenhauer is saying our actions are determined by motives and our character.
Right. How does that even work?
Well, he says the key is this thing called the principium individuationis. It basically means the way we experience ourselves as separate individuals in space and time.
Okay.
Schopenhauer says it's through this principle that the one, universal will appears as many different individuals.
So like we're all just fragments of this one big will.
In a way, yeah. So we do have this feeling of freedom, right? Like we're aware of our own willing making decisions.
Right.
But the me that's doing the willing, the individual me, is already a product of the will, shaped by the principium individuationis.
Okay, so our individual sense of free will is like an illusion.
Not necessarily an illusion, but it's definitely limited. Our actions, as we see them in the world, those are still governed by cause and effect, motives acting on character.
Right. So it's like this tension between the freedom of the will itself and the necessity that governs our individual action.
That's Schopenhauer for you, always pushing us to think deeper. But now let's bring in another philosopher. Plato.
Oh yeah, Plato.
Yeah.
What does he have to do with all this?
Schopenhauer uses Plato's concept of ideas to explain the different levels of how the will objectifies itself. These ideas are like the eternal forms or blueprints of things.
Blueprints.
Yeah, like the perfect, unchanging essence of a thing. They exist outside of time and space.
So like a perfect tree that all other trees are based on.
Precisely. The individual trees we see in the world are just imperfect reflections of that ideal tree, the idea of a tree.
I see. So everything in the world is like a copy of some perfect original.
In a way, yeah. And Schopenhauer says there's a hierarchy to these ideas, a way they unfold from the most basic to the most complex.
So what's at the bottom of this hierarchy?
At the most basic level, you have the forces of nature, the laws that govern the physical world. These are the most general expressions of the will.
Okay.
Then, as you go up the hierarchy, things get more individualized. You have plants, then animals, and finally humans at the top.
And humans are the most individualized.
In a sense, yeah. We have the most complex consciousness, the most developed sense of self. Each step up the hierarchy is like the will becoming more aware of itself, expressing itself in more unique and individual ways.
So the degree of individuality is tied to how the will objectifies itself.
Like a rock doesn't have much individuality, but a dog definitely does, and a human even more so. And Schopenhauer points out that in organic matter, it doesn't have individual character in the same way that living things do.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So we've got this whole system now, the will driving everything, expressing itself in all these different forms. But Schopenhauer is known for being, well, kind of a pessimistic, right? What's up with that?
Yeah, Schopenhauer definitely had a darker view of life than some other philosophers. And it all comes back to the will. Remember how we said the will is this constant striving?
Yeah, it's always wanting something.
And that striving, that wanting, it's never fully satisfied. The will is always reaching for something more, something it can't quite grasp.
So it's like we're always chasing after something, but we never really catch it.
Right, and that's where the suffering comes in. Schopenhauer says that this constant striving, this endless desire, is the root of all suffering.
Because we're never truly content.
There's always this lack, this emptiness that we're trying to fill. Schopenhauer sees life as this struggle against, two main things, death and boredom.
Death, I get that. But boredom.
Yeah, because boredom is what happens when the will is momentarily satisfied. It's like this emptiness that creeps in when we're not actively striving for something.
So we're either suffering from wanting things or suffering from having nothing to want.
Pretty much. It's a pretty bleak outlook, I know.
So we can know the thing in itself. We just have to look inward, at our own deepest nature.
Exactly. He's saying that when we really look at ourselves, Beyond all the surface stuff, beyond our thoughts and our feelings, we find this primal will, this driving force. And that's the same force that's behind everything else in the universe. It's the same force that's making the planet spin and the trees grow. It's all connected.
So in a sense, by understanding ourselves, we're understanding the universe.
That's the idea.
Okay. But if everything is will, if it's all this one unified force, then how do we get to all this diversity? How do we get to the millions of different species of plants and animals, to the vastness of space, to the uniqueness of each individual person? How do we get from this one thing to all these many things?
Yeah, good question. And that's where Schopenhauer introduces this idea of the principium individuationis, the principle of individuation. So he says that time and space are the key. They're the filters, so to speak, that make the one will appear as many. It's through time and space that this fundamental unity is broken up into all these individual separate things. It's like taking a white light and shining it through a prism. You get all these different colors, but the light itself is still one thing.
Right, so the will is the white light, and time and space are the prism. They create the illusion of separateness.
And because of this, we perceive ourselves as individuals, separate from everything else.
Which, of course, leads to all sorts of problems. Because if we're all just expressions of this one will, then why do we have all this conflict? Why do we have this constant struggle for existence?
Right. And Schopenhauer, he doesn't shy away from this. He acknowledges that conflict is inherent in the nature of will. It's built into the system. He even quotes Empedocles, who said, "If no strife were in the world of things, all would be one."
So without conflict, without this struggle, there would be no diversity.
That's the idea. And he sees this conflict playing out everywhere. In the animal kingdom, you have predator and prey, constantly battling for survival. And then in the human world, it's even more pronounced. He uses that famous phrase, homo homini lupus. Man is a wolf to man. We're constantly competing with each other for resources, for status, for power.
So basically, we're all just wolves fighting over scraps, even though ultimately we're all part of the same pack.
Yeah, that's the paradox.
Okay, so if the world is driven by will, if this will is constantly striving and conflicting, then where does that leave us? Are we just stuck in this endless cycle of desire and suffering?
But Schopenhauer does offer a way out, a potential path to escape this suffering.
Oh, really? What is it?
He calls it the denial of the will to live, or Aufhebung des Willens zum Leben.
Denial of the will to live. That sounds pretty intense.
It is. It basically means letting go of all our desires, all the things that the will is constantly striving for.
So like becoming a monk and living in a cave.
Well, Schopenhauer uses the example of the ascetic saint, someone who completely renounces all worldly desires and pleasures. That's the most extreme example. But he says there are other ways to practice this denial, even in everyday life.
So we don't all have to go live in a cave.
No, not necessarily. It's more about recognizing the futility of chasing after things that will never truly satisfy us. It's about finding contentment in a different way, a way that's not based on the will's constant striving.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But how does that contrast with, just living a normal life?
Well, Schopenhauer says that most of us live in this state of constant affirmation of the will. We're always chasing after things, trying to satisfy our desires.
Right. That's just how we're wired, right?
Yeah, it's in our nature. But the problem is, this affirmation of the will often comes at the expense of others. Like, if I want something and you want the same thing, one of us is going to be disappointed.
Yeah, I guess so.
So even in things like, competition or conflict, there's this underlying struggle of wills. Each person is trying to affirm their own will, and that often means denying the will of others.
That's a pretty interesting way to look at it.
It is, and
Yeah.
it shows how even in seemingly ordinary things, there's this deep philosophical dimension at play.
So denial of the will is like the opposite of all that. It's about stepping outside of that struggle, finding a different way to be in the world.
And Schopenhauer says that art, especially aesthetic experience, can give us a taste of what this denial feels like.
Oh, really? How so?
When we're truly absorbed in beauty, whether it's a painting, a piece of music, or even just a beautiful sunset, our will is momentarily silenced. We're not striving for anything, we're just experiencing the beauty in itself.
So it's like a break from all that wanting and striving.
And in those moments, we get a glimpse of the peace and freedom that comes from denying the will. It's like a little taste of enlightenment, a preview of what's possible.
Wow, that's pretty powerful. He's saying that the world, as we experience it, the world as presentation, is ultimately rooted in this fundamental force, the will.
Right.
This will objectifies itself, meaning it takes on different forms, from the basic forces of nature to, plants and animals, and ultimately us, humans. And this striving will, it leads to suffering because it's never truly satisfied.
And the only way out of this suffering is through a radical denial of the will to live, which is a pretty tough thing to do, but it offers a glimpse of true liberation.
Yeah, it's definitely a different way of looking at the world, but it's also kind of eye-opening. It makes you think about, like, all the ways we're constantly striving, all the things we're chasing after.
Understanding this idea, this thesis of Schopenhauer, it can really change how we see the world and how we see ourselves in it.
It's like a whole new lens to interpret our actions, how you relate to nature, even how we experience art.
Exactly. It makes you question everything. Like, if our fundamental reality is all about striving, then what does that mean for things like peace and happiness? Is it even possible to find true fulfillment if we're always caught up in this cycle of wanting?
That's a really good question. And I think that's something for all of us to ponder, as we go about our lives, navigating this world, this presentation. Is there a way to find peace? Not through getting what we want, but through letting go of wanting altogether. It's definitely something to think about.